Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Sorry?
I know. You have to shout over the room next door.
Who's speaking? Okay, so we try to dominate the hosts. Yeah, the presentation today, I was going to call it the hidden roots of disease, but actually this title fits the topic of the symposium, so I use that. The idea is that since we know since the Song Dynasty, Chinese are describing three causes of disease. External, internal, and external. Now they're complaining. Okay, that's all. So in the modern TCM, basically, all we are involved with is the causes like pathogenic factors, wind, cold, or damp heat, etc. And the European or Western style acupuncture starts looking at emotions. The emotions being like the inner cause of disease which were described. But the TCM does not care too much about that. Maybe we can join classes. So basically, when we speak about emotions are our responses to outer stimuli. And when we are treating, for example, emotional factors, we cannot really go deep enough to touch the origin of why a person has such an emotion. So the idea of this presentation is to talk about, to give it an idea about how the psyche is constructed, how we construct our psyche, how we construct our belief systems, and how we are responding to the outside differently.
So,
So meanwhile, the topic is vast. There's a lot of material, and I have tried to make it as concise as possible in this 2.5 hours we have. And I've asked Kevin to make it available via the internet.
The first thing I'm going to talk about is
so psychology, basically Chinese medicine, what we mean by psychology is basically how we perceive the world and how we respond to that.
And when a baby is first recognized, first
perceive the outer world in two manners. The vibrational way, which basically through the channel system, but most of us are not aware of this perception. This is what animals are very sensitive to. I don't know if you're familiar with the Shendrake theory, basically talking about this vibrational medicine. So this one we can at this time exclude. So our main perception of the world is through the sensory organs.
So it's
to an overview of the sensory functions, basically Shen is manifesting in two ways.
About children never getting off their phones, but actually
Shen
need to get off their phones as well, so that when they're with their children, they're really relating.
It is available on the internet.
It's the quality.
Put it available, yeah, because there's a lot of information to take. Is there anything we can do? Shut down the mic there? Delay. Okay.
Can you explain?
They're trying to sort it out. Yeah, this for 3 hours will not be viable. The material is vast, and I'm trying just to give you a teaser here. Obviously, we cannot study and analyze and give examples of how to use it in clinical practice. I'm primarily a clinician, and I don't like just giving theory, but unfortunately, the topic would have required at least 2 days. You're doing it in 2.5 hours. So basically, coming back, Shen has two functions in the sensory perceptions. Chinese refer to as Xingguang and Xingmi. Xingguang can be considered like being conscious, not in a coma. That means I'm aware of the surrounding. And Xingmi, which is clarity, is the clarity of perception. That means the organs, the sensory functions are functioning perfectly and receiving the information and interpreting it. So together, Shen Ming and Shen Guang is the information is interpreted. It's very interesting that what we call reality, the actual reality, is only shared 50%. If all our sensory functions are 100% working properly, I see properly, I hear properly, etc., and we see the same thing, we will only share half. Because there is, the reality is also partially, how to put it, it's not just factual, but also the perception, interpretation, personal interpretation. So it's subjective reality. And subjective reality is part of reality. So at the best, what we call something fact is only shared 50%. Which means that this interpretation itself is dependent on what we call a filtering. process. And this filtering, we know, for example, when we want to go to sleep, we filter out the sounds so the sounds don't bother us. Or on the contrary, when you're a mother who has a baby, you sort of can hear the smallest noise and right away be alert. So the filtering system varies in relation to necessity. But there is also constitution. It's, today it's very fashionable to talk about nature and nurture. So I've made a distinction: constitution, temperament, we will talk about these, and conditioning, which will be nurture. So obviously, what we learn, for example, this is good, this is bad, this is dangerous, this is not, etc., is part of this conditioning. It's going to define our sensory perceptions. It's a famous thing. You're afraid of snakes, and you see a rope, and you jump. Now, it's a rope, it's not a snake. But you have done the association by similarity, and you have reacted emotionally by the fear of having perceived or encountered the snake. So this is just in a very quick overview. We'll be talking a bit more tomorrow in this context, because that's a topic about the head organ sensory functions. We'll also be looking at it tomorrow. The filtering is very interesting because it will be reducing the intensity of the perception, and this also, a lot of the filtering that we do has occurred in very early childhood and cut out certain informations which are too strong for us to handle. Obviously, when an information is really too strong, the filtering is total. That means we shut down. It's like when the fear, you see something which is too fearful, you pass out. Basically, you cut out the consciousness. Or if the sound is too much, etc., we are capable, for protection of the mental functions, is to shut down the information. So this is the. Now let's have a look at the concept of the mind from a Chinese perspective. And basically, the psyche, the way we understand the psyche, is the part of the psyche is the conscious mind, which represents only 1/10, more or less, of the total function of the mind. All the functions of the mind that are dealing with all the different metabolisms and mechanisms in the body, all the rhythmic functions, life maintenance, and also a lot of the psycho-emotional functions are non-conscious. So the part that we relate to is the conscious part of the mind, 9/10 being unconscious, or I'd rather use the term subconscious. And basically, we can understand the conscious part of the mind is obviously dominated by the subconscious. This is why when you decide something, I'm going to stop smoking, it doesn't happen. Your desire is much stronger than your conscious decision. And this goes for many things. And we'll see that in disease as well as in health, this point is very important. The structure of the subconscious I've used, this is the Jungian structure. I tried to fit the conscious and subconscious structure of Freud, but it's more difficult. It doesn't fit the Chinese medical model as nicely. Jung I like very much because he was very influenced by Chinese medicine. And his structure is really very easy to relate to the Western, to the Chinese classical structures. So obviously he speaks about the conscious part of the mind, the self, the Shen. It's how I relate to myself. Part of that is also the image I have of myself, and the image that I project to the outside, the ego. So this, we can say in Chinese medicine, would be equivalent to the concept of Shen and Yi thought, Machoshi calls thought. Then there is the personal unconscious. It's all my personal memories and, let's say, personal um, experiences or traumas that I've had in my life. So these are called personal unconscious. And of course, in there are a lot of repressed emotions, which are going to manifest through in different stages or different situations. And then there is the collective unconscious, which is very interesting because this collective unconscious is extremely strong in the human being, and it defines a lot of things which, for example, ethnic, racial, familial, etc. And Jung has defined these archetypes from this perspective. Now, in our Chinese system, this can be related to, first of all, this unconscious can be related to Hun and Po. You remember these are called the animal spirits. They are closer to the body. They don't have the consciousness of Shen and Yi. In the ideograms, both of them contain Gui, ghost. And it's very interesting because Hun is about all the memories of suppressed feelings and concepts and words that you have heard. And Po is the memory of physical trauma. It's memories which are registered in the Po are registered in the body. And these are, they will manifest themselves, if we have time, I'll give you some examples. The third level of the subconscious, which can be what we call the collective unconscious, includes, of course, the Zhi, which is stored in the kidney and obviously very connected to the gene, inherited energies. Now, if we talk about belief systems, what has made my belief system is basically partially constitutional, conditioning, of course, and culture, personal experiences and memories, and some of these experiences and memories are predating the development of the memory system in the mind, in the brain, which means the limbic system. And these are memories which, for example, around birth or even before birth until the ages of 4 or 5. After that, the limbic system starts getting developed, so the memories have more context. Before that, they are usually stored in the body. So these are words that we have heard, expressions that we have heard. It's very important. That's why now they have understood that even under anesthesia, general anesthesia, the patient, although they are disconnected, they are reactive to words that they hear. So it's very important that the surgeons become more conscious not to say certain things during an operation because the patient registers them. The subconscious registers them. This was discovered by an anesthesiologist who was experimenting on patients and giving them subliminal information during anesthesia, and discovered, for example, a smoker patient to whom he had suggested that smoking, he hated smoking. When they, after they woke up and they smoked a cigarette, they vomited. They couldn't understand what was going on, and then he understood that it was working. And since then, what they do now, we have to be very careful what you say during an operation. When I think in the times I was in the surgical rooms, what the surgeons would say about these poor patients, you know, sometimes you even wonder how they survived. So now at least we have become more conscious. So this is also the same thing that happens under hypnosis. In hypnotic trance, suggestions are made to replace other memories which are, I don't want to use the word negative, but they're harmful for the person. We can replace them with memories which are positive. Memory is actually, there's no such thing as actual memory. Memory is also subjective. It's not fact. It's what we believe. And there's a lot of work done today on memory. So the subconscious physical memories are registered by Po, and these are all the physical traumas that we have received early childhood or even later. If you have an accident, a car accident, maybe you went into a coma, after the accident, but your body registered the whole impact, and this is going to manifest. It's sort of like trauma management. We have to also deal with this physical memory of the body. Now, we talked about constitution and heredity. So we are familiar with the three elements of the hereditary energies. Yuan Qi, which I always like to put a parallel between Chinese medicine and Western, let's say, concepts, medical concepts, and Western discoveries. So far, Yuan Qi has no Western equivalent. We used to believe in God. We said this is spark of God, and today we don't believe in God, but still life is there. So what is Yuan Qi? We don't have a clear definition. Jin, obviously, is the chromosomic inheritance. And the chromosomic inheritance, for the time when I studied medicine, we believed that everything transmitted through the chromosomes was invariable and obviously would manifest itself. We know that the form, color of the skin, eyes, hair, etc., are invariables. They will manifest. But other information in the genetic code, for example, now they discover certain diseases are genetically transmitted. Breast cancer. But breast cancer does not manifest on everybody who has this gene. Why? They say you have maybe 60% chance of having cancer if you have the gene. But what about the 40% who don't get it? What about those who get it and they don't have the gene? So there's a lot of question marks around this until recent years where we have started talking about epigenetics. When I studied, when we studied the DNA helix, the codes, there was a section that was coding all the proteins, future proteins of the body. And there were the two terminal segments, which we used to call in French nonsense. That means they were codes, but they did not translate into anything specific. So they didn't know what they were for. Today we discovered that those sections are actually very important. Those proteins are going to activate or deactivate certain genes in the genetic code, epigenetics. Now, what is making them active or disactive is environment, is the mind. That means, for example, you have the gene for breast cancer, you smoke, you live in a polluted place, you eat the wrong foods, and especially the doctor tells you, oh, your mother had breast cancer and you have the gene. The process starts. 100% sure you're going to develop breast cancer. You have all the elements. On the other hand, you neutralize all these elements. You have a healthy life, etc., etc. You cannot get breast cancer because you don't activate that gene. So this is environment is only causing the disease if we believe that it is doing it. Otherwise, in the world we are living, it doesn't make sense that we keep multiplying. Humanity should have disappeared. We are polluting the sea, we are polluting the air, we are polluting everything. We should be all dead. And yet we are multiplying. There has never been so many people on the earth. So something doesn't fit. Maybe it will happen. Who knows? Next generation it will happen. But anyway, this is very, very important, and they have discovered that actually my mental state defines the activity of what we call the zong qi. The Chinese call ancestral qi. And I remember originally when we were learning the system, I asked the question, why ancestral? They said, oh, it's the energy of the environment and the state of the mother during the 9 months of pregnancy. Well, why is it called ancestral? No answer. Today we understand that a lot of the stuff are transmitted through the epigenetics. And these are becoming activated later in future generations. This is why it's called ancestral, and this includes also a lot of the behavior of the thing. You have heard about family constellations. They work a lot with transmitted family traits, habits, behaviors, to which it's not the gene, it's not necessary. Not every offspring has it. But some will manifest it very strongly. You know, in us, I have two siblings, and one of them, my sister, acts exactly like my grandmother. It's unbelievable. We sometimes look at her, it's like my grandmother has changed the body and has incarnated in her behavior, in her life, dislikes, and this and that. So we can see that it's not genetic, but it has been transmitted. This defines the Zongqi, also Chinese refer to it as astrology. That means the alignment of the planets at the moment of conception, not birth. Of course, we use the birth landmark, which is reflecting the moment of conception. But it's very interesting, the Chinese say that at the 5th month of the fetal life, we're talking lunar months, the temperament is established. And we see that in babies that are born, they come already with their temperament. You know, the fire type, which is hysterical, doesn't sleep well, screams, is throwing tantrums. The quiet one, the smiling one, the one that loves eating, the one who hates eating, refuses the food or throws up. The temperament is already there, it's established. And sometimes it's actually, quite uncanny, it has nothing to do with the constitution. Because you can have you can be in a wood country, wood parents, the child has a wood constitution, but the temperament can be either Shao Yang or Xue Yin option. And then, I mean, this is a simplistic explanation, but you can have all kinds of modification. After birth conditioning can define also the temperament. So, now let's quickly go over the development of the extraordinary that precede, remember, they precede the junk food, therefore they precede all of the 5 zhi, the 5 wills, the 5 what we call spirits. So it's very important to understand that they are in charge of the organization of life. And there is a there's a plan, what do you call it, the blueprint, thank you. The blueprint that is going to be us, me, but somebody has to make it into 3 dimensions, and that's a Chongmei, the function of Chongmei. So the Chinese have described the extraordinary in 3 groups: first, second, and third ancestry. The first ancestry, the first extraordinary responsible for this function, for this development, is Chongmei. Chongmei is going to interpret the blueprint, which is the genetic code and the Zongqi, into a viable form. And remember that the Ren and Du are offshoots of Chong. Chong, which is what we call the central channel, and these 2 are the offshoots. Later they describe them independently, but in original case, many times Ren is the frontal branch of Chongmei and Du the dorsal branch. Many put Dai Mei in the third ancestry. I don't agree. I put it in the first ancestry, and I'll explain to you why I believe it's part of the first ancestry. The second ancestry is how the body is developing, and it's the inner spaces, outer spaces, so obviously it's the Wei channels, yin and yang Wei, and they're also responsible for management of time and space. It's a concept, time and space, which is defining rhythm. is defined and regulated, managed by yin-yang wei and yin-yang chao. We'll come back to that. So basically, we can say that the aging process is defined by these rhythms. So that's why when the Chinese talk about cycles of 7 and 8, they are talking about this aging process. Now, 7 and 8 is a nice model, but please don't be too, I would say, mathematical about it. It's not true that girls, they reach the first maturity at 7, they reach puberty at 14, etc. This used to be more or less true for a certain area of China. First of all, if you go north, the time is more delayed. You go south, you go to Africa, the girls can get their periods at the age of 7, 8, 9. And then, another thing I have observed is that these rhythms are accelerating in the general population. If you have noticed, what we learn, a child at the age of so many months can hold his neck and can lift his trunk, and then can stand, can walk, can this and that. Everything is now accelerated. We see children maturing faster. So obviously this is a reflection of what we consider global warming. Global warming is not just the North Pole melting, it's also what is going on everywhere on the Earth, including inside us. We do have a major global warming internally. A lot of our modern diseases, which we have a lot of difficulty dealing with, are actually diseases of heat. A lot of heat diseases. So we'll see that, I mean, it's obviously we are reflecting the world we are living in and vice versa. It's not a mystery. Chinese have said it for centuries. So these cycles of 7 and 8 are symbolic. Don't take them literally. And we usually say that at the age of 7, the kidneys start firming up. And this is where children start getting their permanent teeth. But actually, another interesting thing which starts happening at the ages of 7 and 8, or let's say at the first firming up of the kidney, is that the yin and yang chao starts becoming activated. The child is born with the rhythms of the mother, which means that, you know, the child has the immune system is having the immune system of the mother and will need some time to develop its own immunity. This is one of the big criticisms of immunization of small children, where they used to immunize them against 3 diseases, now it's 7, then it's going to I don't know how many, and the children are not allowed to naturally develop this immune system. It's a big debate. I don't want to get into it. There's a lot of for and against it. So basically, keep in mind that these 2 systems have to do a lot with the rhythms, like puberty, like maturity. Age of maturity used to be 21, where we got the wisdom teeth. It's very interesting. In the West, they didn't have this concept where it was 3 times 7. 21 was the age of maturity, where supposedly now you are wise enough to vote. They say, no, you don't need to be wise. You can do it at 18. In the States, you have to be 21 to drink, 18 to drive, but you can buy a gun at 12. That is freedom. So, I mentioned that I believe Daimei is part of the primary extraordinary units. What happens in the cell, the original cell, which is actually fabulous. We come from one cell. And it's just thinking about it, you know, the father and mother joined their precious DNAs and made one cell, which will become me later. And this cell splits into 2. What makes the cell split is a polarization that takes place. That means the cell that doesn't have a North Pole, South Pole becomes polarized by the movement of these 2 little things which are called the centrioles. Once there is polarization, and I believe this is done by Chongmei, the medial channel which is actually giving a yin and yang dimension to the cell. Once this happens, the nucleus membrane breaks, the DNA, the chromosomes, they split, they duplicate and split up into identical pairs, and then there is from outside sort of this tightening that takes place, which splits the cell into two. This, for me, is the function of diamond. That's why in some texts they call it the outer organizer. Chongmei is the inner organizer, and Daimei is the outer organizer. It makes sense. So then we have two identical cells. And this continues for a while, identical cells, and then all of a sudden there is a division into three different structures, endoblast, mesoblast, and ectoblast, which is going to be the origin of all the billions of cells specializing in different things, the organs, etc., etc. It's a totally mind-blowing thing, and what is fabulous is that the Chinese did not have microscopes. They had no way of actually knowing it, but they had symbolically assumed it. That's why they say origin of life is three. Why three? Everything in Chinese you see is subdivided into three sections. So this is a little bit of embryology. So what takes place originally when the cells are multiplying, they're going to create a mass. And you will have here Chong, which is going to organize internally, Dai, which will organize externally, and the front and the back, which starts appearing, which is going to be the red and the blue. And you know the spinal cord is the first structure that starts curving itself, and then you have the spine, which is going to give then the space for the spinal cord to develop. So the first nervous system, the primitive nervous system, starts developing. Now, the inherited energy is going to be stored in the future lower tanchen. As the embryo grows in the sort of in an elongated manner, the original area is going to be what we call the original fire, the Mingmen, which later will manifest itself. Which will manifest itself in a point by the same name, Mingmen. The kidney gene will be transformed by the kidney fire into kidney qi, and this kidney qi is going to be the origin of the development of all the zhengqi. Now what happens is that one of the first primitive channels, Du, which is going to be responsible for the development of the spine, the spinal cord, and the sea of marrow, the brain, will distribute this original energy to points, original bladder channel, and this energy will then, from the bladder shoe points, concentrate and be directed towards the zhengqi. Now here is what is very interesting. The distribution of this original energy to the back shoe points, I mean these are the future back shoe points, are not equal. So if you have a constitution of wood, you would get much more energy around the area of bladder 18 and 19, so you will get much more energy to the liver or gallbladder, for example. If you have a constitution of fire, you will have much more going towards the organs, which will later be the fire organs. So this is how the constitution is going to influence the development of the organs. Now, at this time, of course, it can be positive or negative. We know that depending if you have done Chinese astrology, there are certain years. For example, if it's a wood year, you have plus years and minus years. That means in this year, the liver will get more energy, will be more activated, and in a wood minus year, it will be the opposite. So it's not because you're a wood type, the wood is the strong element. It could be also the weak element, where you have problems. So this is a little parallel to how the constitution is developed at this time. Okay? So the psychological profile of the extraordinary channels. Now, I'm often asked about the origin of this information. Historically, the extraordinary channels were rooted in pre-heaven energy. And you know that pre-heaven energy in the old days, you could not touch heaven. Therefore, jinn, which was a pre-heaven energy, could not be modified. This was for centuries, this belief was rooted not only in Chinese medicine, but in Chinese thought. Emperor was the son of heaven. You couldn't touch the emperor. And then one day some general said, why not? I declare myself emperor. And nothing happened. They said, oh, you know, the sky will open and horrors will happen. Nothing happened. He became emperor. And then other generals, they said, why not me? And this is the period in Chinese history which is called the warring state period. Everybody wanted to be son of heaven. Why not? I declare myself son of heaven. Now, the same with the extraordinary channels. They were described, but they were beyond the reach of the primary. This is what the text say. They are beyond the reach of the primary. That means you cannot work with them. Sun Simiao in the 7th century declared that you can modify the jinn. He was using the extraordinary in Qigong, not in acupuncture. And you know, until the 17th, 18th century, the extraordinary were not used in daily practice. They were used in Qigong. Only then they gave, in the 18th century, they gave the points, the coupling points, etc. What we are using today is only 200 years old at the most. And even then, there were not much text about how to use them, applications. Now, one of the works I have done, which is in the book Kevin was quoting, Bridging the Gap, is to look at the origins of Chinese acupuncture and where it has come from. Of course, we have TCM. But TCM is not traditional. TCM is not even 100 years old. The word TCM was coined during the Cultural Revolution, the Communist Cultural Revolution in China, as opposition to Western medicine. And then what they did was everything that didn't fit a communist thought was thrown out. Spirits, ghosts, emotions. Good Chinese communist doesn't have emotions. Wipe it out. I remember when I went my first contact with my Chinese teachers, I had studied in France and we had talked about a lot about emotions, the spirits, you know, the Benchen, the five spirits. I would ask them questions and they would look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? And then one of the teachers, I pestered him a bit. You should not pester a Chinese master. If they don't answer, respect. Either they don't know, which means that if they say, they lose face, or they know but they believe that you are not ready to hear, in which case, again, you have to respect. Anyway, after a few times, I had a teacher got angry. You Westerners all the time talk about emotion, emotion. What is this? Emotion don't cause disease. Now, here, those Chinese people who have come to the West, they themselves, they say, oh, you know, there's a Chinese teacher in Switzerland who's treating everyone, the first session, large investment for liver treatment. I said, why do you do this all the time? He says, all of you people are stressed. Okay, so there is an emotional factor. Now, the use of the extraordinary, so I was mentioning the sources. So one is the classical Chinese medicine. Classical Chinese medicine are all the ancient traditions and texts. Now, all the authors who have written about Chinese medicine and quoted points are using the same text. The text, if you know historically, when the imperial college was formed during the Ming Dynasty, they gathered all the teachers to write down all the instructions on Chinese medicine. Who came? Those who knew how to read and write. And who were they? The Confucianists. So all the basic textbooks which were written later on Chinese medicine, herbology, everything, was written by Confucian scholars. The Taoists, who were usually healers in the market, and they were three categories: those who were in temples, those who were in caves and meditated, and the third category went into the public in the marketplace and treating people. They didn't know how to read and write, and by instruction they were not supposed to write. A lot of the Taoist masters never wrote a book. Their disciples wrote about their teachings. So there is a whole oral tradition in China that was not written down, and yet it exists. Now, purists, when I was quoting some of these oral traditions, I remember in France I was giving a lecture, and I had this French sinologist who stood up and said, "Which text does it come from?" It's the oral tradition. You cannot give any credit to oral tradition. I said, sorry, I don't give credit. I'm a technician. I'm a clinical practitioner. I hear something, I try it. It works, it works. It doesn't work. If it's written in the book and it doesn't work, I throw the book away. Sorry. And I did with a lot of concepts which are written in books, and maybe sometimes I realize a lot of times we misinterpreted them. That's why they didn't work for us. Much later I realized that, yeah, using them differently works. So anyway, the oral tradition came, we don't have time for history, it came down South China, went to Vietnam, and created the Vietnamese tradition of acupuncture, and then from there came to France. And obviously in the French acupuncture we have concepts which you don't find in any of the classical texts. So I have some of the information about extraordinary channels from my French schooling, and a lot from Jeffrey Ewan, who's a Taoist master. Again, he refuses to write, and I was very fortunate to have him in our school for 10 years. He was coming sometimes twice a year, lecturing, and I gathered, compiled all his lectures, and later when I wrote the book, I sent it to him for correction. So he actually has done corrections there, but he will not sign the book or, put his name on any of that. It's my responsibility. So basically, we start with Qigong. Now, Qigong plays a major role, not only in our physical formation, but also is going to be a major channel dealing with later what goes on. And when we do constitutional therapy, we always start with Qigong, and we'll see very soon why is that. So these are basically, I'm not going to enumerate, these are the attributes of Qigong that you know and you find in every book, but some of them I underline because, for example, it's sea of blood. Okay, it manages blood. But what is blood in the terminology that we are using concerning the mind, the emotions, and the psyche? First of all, the blood houses the Shen. So it means that the Shen is delicately related to the state of blood. Second, blood is responsible for the management of emotions. Why? Because I mentioned before, we respond to the outer world via the law. The law are going to manage our connection to the outer world, and how we respond to the outside is through the emotional responses we have. The law will manage that, and it is a concept which is missing again in the classical literature, because one thing I didn't mention, you remember the big burning of the books by Kieu Wang-ti, the crazy guy who wanted to unify China. So his idea to unify China was we made one language. to make one language. We burn all the books and we write them in the same writing. He managed to do that. Today, if you go to Beijing or to Shanghai, they don't speak the same Chinese, but they write the same Chinese. And the consequence of burning of the books was many books were lost, including 2 books. You know, we always talk about the Neqing, Suwen, and the Lingshu being the basis of Chinese medicine, and Shanghai, of course. But there were 2 books that were lost. How do we know they were lost? Because information persisted in Japan. They had translated the lower text, and in Vietnam. In the Vietnamese medicine, Chinese medicine, there are topics which are not covered, and including the Lo, the Jingye, all the secondary channels. We don't know how to use them. Why? Because the original texts are vague adopted. If you see the leading books on the market, which is Deadman and Khafaji's book on acupuncture, he mentions the Lo, mentions the Jingye, but there is no clinical indication. Machocha, for whom I have a lot of respect, he was one of our teachers in our school for many years. His passage on the Jingye, he says, these channels are not used in clinical practice. They only explain inner connections. And yet the ancient texts, they say the Jingye seem easy to the beginner. Only the experienced practitioner knows their difficulty. So obviously they're putting emphasis somewhere. So to say that there's a lot of information that has come to France via Soulier de Mohan and the Vietnamese school and the oral tradition. So I've put it all together, and what I'm presenting about the extraordinary more or less comes from these sources. So the Sea of Blood basically is an emphasis that Chong will be very, very responsible in our emotional responses. Harmonious chi flow, and one of the major uses I make of Chong is what they call the running piglet syndrome. The running piglet syndrome, which for me always was an amusing thing. The Chinese, they have such an imagination. What does it mean to have a running piglets in your belly? What does it mean? Until I discovered this is actually what we call panic attack. And God knows it's common. And I used Chong with, together with Yin Wei, and excellent results. So these are aspects of also in the psychological uses of Chong, and especially a relation to the Gao Wang. It took me years to understand, maybe 20 years to understand what is this Gao Wang. Do you know what Gao Wang is? No. Wang is nourishment, and Gao is a membrane. And the translations were given is the fatty tissue that surrounds the heart. Fatty tissue that surrounds the heart. What the hell? Why have the Chinese given 5 points Huang names? And they have nothing to do with the heart. So fortunately, again, Jeffrey came to our, he saved us, explaining what the notion of Gao Huang is. It's a protective membrane surrounding the zangfu. In the abdomen, it's the peritoneum. In the chest, it's the pericard, or the pleura. These are very important membranes which are protecting and at the same time allowing nourishment, exchange of blood and nutrients. But besides that, the concept of Huang is about nourishment. And there are 5 Huang points, and look which ones. Bladder 43, bladder 51, bladder 53, and Reme 6, and of course kidney 16. And interestingly, bladder 43, which is the famous Sun Si Miao point for 100 diseases. It's about nourishment of the self, self-nourishment. What, do you know the nickname this point has in Western acupuncture? No, but the nickname they give it, the broken heart point. Broken heart point, it's the origin of 100 diseases. What is a broken heart? It's rejection. Lack of self-love, lack of self-trust is one of the wrong points. Ladder 51. In the text, they say empirical point for breasts. We use this point for when you want to stop the breast milk or increase it, etc. What empirical? Where is it situated? On the level of the triple warmer action point, production of energy. Very interesting. 53, the horn of the uterus. So it's on the pelvic area, and it really has to do with sexuality and sexual satisfaction. I've written nourishment, but it's mostly like sexual satisfaction. Retin 6 is the general point, source of point, and then kidney 16, the umbilical cord, next to the umbilical cord. So you really see that the horn have to do with nourishment, and specifically lack of this nourishment. Therefore, a lot of pathologies we will be seeing that have to do with chong, and especially with Renme, are compensation pathologies. Like all these food problems, anorexia, bulimia, or addictions, drinking, smoking, etc., or sexual addictions, etc. These are all compensation points. And Chinese have given, you will see that with Renme, they have given the word worms, the 3 worms. Or they call also, they refer to them as ghosts. I love these terms, ghosts, because, you know, they threw it out with the Chinese Revolution. Ghosts don't exist. But they do exist. These are all the energetic accumulations that make us do things without the conscious mind being present. And here in England, you are familiar with the Worsley, the 7 dragon treatment against ghosts, you know, internal, external. But there is no, it's a method, but we need to go a bit further, understand where the ghost is coming from. You cannot just randomly come and exercise the rule. It's good to know which ghost is haunting the house. Okay? So I finish with this before the break. Chong is basically affected during the 9 months of pregnancy and very soon after birth. So any trauma which is affecting the mother during her pregnancy period, and this is not just physical, it can very especially be emotional trauma, or around birth, will affect the chong. So when we are dealing with the patient, I always ask about the circumstances of their pregnancy, of their, not their pregnancy, but the mother's pregnancy and their birth circumstances. And if there's anything a bit off, I try to later find confirmation that it has affected the chong in some way or another. So we always start by regulating the chong rate. Now, obviously, the emotional pattern, chong is the central channel. It's my stance. It's my central rectitude. When chong has been affected, people have difficulty with that. They don't have a good relation. They don't have a relation to the body. What I call, what do I have? Anyway, they have difficulty integrating the body. We say incarnation difficulty. It's like they are hardly in the body. They're ready to go. These are people who very easily can give up. Life gets difficult, I commit suicide. I give up. Now, some people suffer a lot and they say, okay, the pain is too much, I want to go. I want to leave. But in other cases, it's not even that much, it's just psychological. They're unhappy and they commit suicide. So this is lack of integration. The looking for some kind of idealization, because the mother, the symbol of mother goddess can be replaced by, some guru, some place that I'm searching for, etc. overly dependent. Yeah, I have said incarnation issues, lack of meaning in life. And especially all of these problems, they manifest even more strongly in transitional periods. When transitional periods being puberty, menopause, or even events like marriage, divorce, etc. And then in all of us, we have experienced birth trauma. Everybody has experienced. There are 3 traumas at birth and natural birth. Basically, loss of darkness, which, in a modern day birthing place, you have this big scientific light with, a lot of light. This poor child has been in this nice, warm, dark womb and is born into this harsh light. Loss of buoyancy, this is like the floating, this loss, and this hysterical emergency cutting of the umbilical cord. In the older times, they believed because of the resist factor, they were cutting it so that the blood would not get mixed. Today, it's totally irrelevant. Modern day birthings are trying to respond to that, giving birth in a bathtub with candlelight around, maybe your husband playing the guitar. Or not. And especially not cutting the umbilical cords quickly, putting the child on the mother's chest and waiting for the umbilical cord to shrivel, or for the placenta to naturally be eliminated. Now with this, we reduce the stress. But even cesarean birth has consequences, because the cesarean birth avoids, deprives the child from going through the canal, which has for purpose to press, especially bladder 1, where we'll see it's a major point in yin and yang child harmonization, rhythmic harmonization, and therefore daylight adapting to daylight and so on. So each of these traumas has consequences which might manifest later. I remember Machocha, when he did a course for us on psychology, he was seeing young children, like teenagers, who walked on the tips of their feet, and for him that was a sure sign that they had psychological issues. And this obviously is confirmed that it's Chung that has this responsibility. Okay, so we'll continue after the break.